What's up, everybody? It's been a long time since we had a basement stats video, so let's jump right in. Let's talk about some bias. So it's been so long, I don't even remember what I'm doing. Kind of. All right, so bias. This is a word we've all heard, before. I'm sure at some point talk about a person being biased or something. Maybe this is like something that's going on in society a lot. Everyone's got their own biases. But we want to think statistically, right? We want to think about what this means in terms of sampling. And so for us, when we talk about a sample being biased, we're talking about the composition of that sample, what the sample looks like. So before we kind of get into the stuff, right, here's our goal, right? Not just my class, but anybody for the exam. Here's what we got to be able to do, right? So we want to be able to describe how a sample might be or is biased based on the method being described. So oftentimes on the AP exam on a free response, they'll give us a description of how a sample was taken, some context about what they're measuring, what they're surveying about, right? What data they're recording. And we might have to explain how their sampling method can lead to a biased sample. Second thing, maybe this is a multiple choice. Second thing is we want to know which sampling methods lead to bias. And so generally speaking, random samples help us or protect us against bias, right? When we use randomization, it helps us to reduce the impacts of bias. We can minimize the effects of bias. Really, bias isn't something we can eliminate entirely. We can do our best, but most samples are going to maybe, have a tiny bit of bias. Our job is to reduce that. So we want to know which sampling methods we want to avoid because they lack randomization and lead to bias. And then the third thing, this is probably more likely like a multiple choice style question. We're going to look at 4 types of bias. And so if we're given a context, given a situation, given how a sample has been collected, a sampling method, we might have to identify what we think is going to be the most prevalent type of bias in that scenario. So those are our goals, right? So back to bias. So textbook definition here, definitely want to jot this down in our notes. So bias is when some part of our population is over or underrepresented. And so that can happen in a lot of ways, right? I could take a simple random sample and I could end up with a biased sample. Let's say I'm trying to take a sample of 200 East Hartford High School students. I use a simple random sample. It's possible that I randomly select 200 freshmen. Right. And in that case, I've way overrepresented the freshmen, right? They don't represent the entire population like my sample would in this made up example. I've underrepresented or not represented all the other classes. But at the same time, right, if I randomly generate 200 student ID numbers or pull 200 student names out of a hat, it's pretty unlikely that I'm going to pull out, all freshmen. And of course, that's an extreme example, right? But that's the idea. When we randomize, there's a chance that we're going to get a biased sample, right? But that chance is generally low. Now, when we talk about collecting data, right, any conclusions that we draw from biased data are going to be flawed. So if we don't do a good job collecting our sample, all the stuff we're going to learn how to do afterwards, all the graphical displays we create to summarize the data, all the summary stats we calculate, measures of center and spread and position, and then all the statistical inference we do afterwards that we're learning later in the course, right? All that stuff is meaningless if it's based on a flawed data set. So in real life, right, you're going to put a lot of your time and effort and money and energy into designing how you collect your data, right? Because if we don't do a good job collecting our data, right, there's no way to salvage our data, right? There's no way to fix it. Gathering that data the right way is arguably the most critical, probably is the most critical part of the statistical process, right? Because in order to draw reliable conclusions, they need to be based on a reliable data set. A few kind of tidbits about bias. I don't know why I put this out of order. Pause the video. Try it out. See what you think. I know we haven't talked about it. So which statements are true? Bias results from random variation and will always be present. Why isn't that true? We might try to argue that bias will always be present to some degree, to at least to a super small degree. But bias does not result from random variation. Bias results from usually poor sampling methods. And that's why we've taken so much time to learn the right ways to collect a sample so we can try to avoid that bias. Anything around Roman numeral 2 there? Bias results from a sampling method likely to produce samples that do not represent the population. Absolutely. This is true, right? This is what leads to bias, not random variation, not luck, although that can be the case, but typically from a method that produces samples that don't represent the population, right? So if you go survey, you want to survey high school students about their post-high school plans, and you go survey all your classmates in your classes, right, in AP stats, that's not a good way. That convenient sample is not going to get the job done. There's no randomization. And by taking a convenient sample and just asking the other people in AP stats, you might overrepresent people who plan to go to college, right? You might overrepresent people who, right, because people in an AP class are kind of putting themselves on that track. Not everybody, but you might overrepresent that group. Or maybe at your school, you have to be a senior to take AP stats. So then if you only do that convenient sample and survey your class, you're going to overrepresent seniors, or maybe overrepresent seniors and juniors, right? Like at East Hartford High, if you only ask AP stat people, we're going to get a couple sophomores, some juniors, mostly seniors, and no representation from freshmen. Lastly, this is a tricky one. Bias is reduced when sample size is larger. And this is also false. Because if you do a poor job collecting the data, right? If you have a poor sampling method, just because you sample 1,000 over 100, that doesn't make your sample less biased, right? It's even though you used a larger sample size, it's still like based on a crappy process, a crappy method. So larger sample size is not going to reduce bias. Bias is going to be reduced if we improve our sampling method. I don't know what just happened there, but that kind of works, right? That kind of looks like an E. And so here, I think we're going to go with 2 only. That's just a good question to help us kind of get some of the, I don't know, facts about bias. I don't know what I'm talking about. All right. So getting into some specific types of bias, we want to look at 4. So we have 2 methods. I should have had you pause, right, and say, what are the 2 methods we've looked at that don't incorporate randomization? And hopefully you would realize voluntary response sample, right? We give people the chance to respond, and those who decide to vote do that. No randomization. Now, often in the back of your head, you're thinking, what was that other method we looked at that lacked randomization? So this is our classic online poll or the reviews that you're reading online on Yelp, right? That's all voluntary response. And one of the reasons we don't like a voluntary response sample is a voluntary response sample often leads to voluntary response bias. So voluntary response bias is a specific type of bias. And it's the idea that if you use a voluntary response sample, the people with the strongest opinions are more likely to respond. And then as a result, I don't know why this wasn't in my definition, but as a result, those stronger opinions are going to be overrepresented. Think about it. We go to stores all the time, right? They try to give you a receipt and they're like, hey, there's this survey, you get a discount, whatever. If you don't really care about what happened at the store, you're like, yeah, whatever. Like it was just a normal trip to the store, right? Like you're probably not going to go online and vote or whatever, respond in that survey. But if you had like the worst experience ever, I don't know, the customer service was terrible or something, maybe now you're more motivated to go, right, fill out that survey. Or if maybe you have the nicest cashier of all time or some super awesome person was helping you out in the store and you want to hook them up with a good review, now you're more motivated, right, to go on and fill out that survey. The people with the strongest opinions are most likely to respond. And we see that with online reviews. So go start reading some online reviews. And you know, a lot of times you're going to see extreme opinions, right? Like if I buy a new laptop and it's like, all right, like it's a standard laptop, right? Like I'm probably not going online to fill out a review about it. Or if I go to a restaurant and it's all right, I'm probably not going on Yelp to write a review. But if it's the best food I've ever eaten, best service I've ever eaten, awesome people, awesome environment, I might feel obligated like, man, I got to go write a review. That place was awesome. Or if it's the worst thing I've ever experienced, I might go online and trash that place, take out my anger on Yelp, I guess. So that's the deal. Voluntary response samples, no good. Now, what's tricky is with technology in 2021, right? We can instantaneously get millions of votes on a Twitter poll and have tons of data to use, but we have to be aware that that's not the most reliable data set because it wasn't based on a randomly selected sample. and we're going to have to be concerned about voluntary response bias. Next up, hopefully we're thinking that other method that lacked randomization are convenience samples, right? That's when we're feeling lazy. That's when we just ask our classmates in AP stats about their post-high school plans. So here, literally what it sounds like, taking the easy way out. And so the problem with convenience sampling, I shouldn't box that because that's not really our focus for today. Our focus is the bias, is usually a convenience sample isn't representative of the population. And that's because convenience sampling often leads to undercoverage. And so undercoverage is when some part of the population is left out or isn't sampled. You know, maybe it's underrepresented, maybe it's not sampled at all, but it's our fault for our sampling method. So back to surveying our classmates in AP stats. If I just survey my AP stat classmates, I'm never going to survey a freshman, right? They're never going to have the opportunity to respond. I have undercovered freshmen. Or there's only like whatever, less than 5 sophomores who take AP stats for us this year. So you're not going to get, right? Sophomores are probably about 25% of our whole school. But if you just survey your classmates, you're not going to have a sample that's 25% sophomores. They're going to be underrepresented. They were undercovered because we were lazy and didn't feel like collecting a random sample, whether simple, random, or stratified or cluster, the way that we were supposed to. So undercoverage is what it sounds like. We undercover, right? We miss some people in our population, but the key thing is that it's our fault, right? It's our method leaving out some part of the population. 2 more. Lots of notes here. Hopefully you're writing this all down. Like if you're not, you gotta like rewind it and start writing these down because you're not gonna remember them if you don't write them down, man. Google it. Plenty of studies. Anyways, non-response bias. This is something that's pretty much inherently gonna show up in any poll, any survey we try to do. Non-response bias is the idea that not everyone will respond, but additionally, it's that those people who don't respond might have different opinions about whatever we're surveying about. So a lot of times I see students say for non-response bias, just not everyone responds. But like if all the people who didn't respond were going to say the same thing as the people who did, it wouldn't matter that they didn't respond. The key is that not everyone responds, and the people who don't might have a different opinion. This is like pretty much always going to exist. Now, this is not the fault of the design. This is like on the person. This is, I hand you the survey, you throw it in the garbage, right? So undercoverage is I never even hand you a survey. Non-response bias is I hand you a survey, you have the opportunity to respond, you just choose not to. Right? We've all done that. We've all hung up on the people when we get those robocalls. And so generally speaking, right, there's always going to be some non-response bias. We prefer to have a smaller sample size with a high proportion who respond than just sending out a million surveys and having 950,000 of them getting thrown out. But yeah, and again, right, the difference with undercoverage is sampling methods are bad. Non-response bias is like, you're bad. You throw out the survey, man. You chose not to vote. That's why when we go get our receipt at the store, they offer that 10% discount or whatever for next time. They're trying to minimize non-response bias, right? They're trying to give us incentive to respond so that we don't throw out that survey. The last one we're going to look at in here is response bias. So response bias is anything in our survey design that influences the response. Now, the most common way we see response bias is in the wording of a question, or I think maybe in AP Psych, I could be wrong, but I think you talk about leading questions, right? So a leading question is the most common example of response bias. You know, if I say something like, given that it's the most applicable math in daily life, do you think students should take statistics in high school? Right? Like I'm trying to lead you towards a certain response. And as a result in that example, I'm probably going to have the answer, yes, stats should be required, overrepresented. Or an example I've seen is not in my brain anymore. My brain just went totally black. I don't know what just happened. That was crazy. And we can come up with tons of examples, and we're going to start to look at some in class, of course, right? So the wording of the question leading you one way or another is going to be an example of response bias. But it's not only the wording of the question. If I want to survey students, do you think I'm an effective teacher? Right? I should give you that survey anonymously, right? I should probably not even be in the room. Maybe it's a Google form, you just click, right? I never know who did it, right? Like if I call you in one by one and have you sit at my desk across from me and I'm like, all right, what's up? Think I'm a good, effective stats teacher? you're all nice people, right? You're going to feel pressured by the design of that. The fact that I'm asking you to face to face, right? Like in this environment, putting the pressure on, putting you on the spot, right? You're going to feel pressured to say yes. So the design, the setup, right, on my end is influencing your response. You're feeling pressured to say I'm an effective teacher because you're a nice person, I think. So it's not just the wording of the question, but anything in that design. So those are our 4 types of bias, along with a general definition, some general ideas about bias. Now, over the next couple of days, we want to focus more on how to write about bias on the AP exam. And so thinking about that, some tips that we definitely want in our notes too, like, like all this stuff in our notes. So when we're writing about bias, the first thing, or they don't have to be in this order, but one thing we want to do is we want to describe who or what group is over or underrepresented as a result of our sampling method. So think about the method, think about what you're measuring, right? So we always want to connect this to the response variable, right? To what data is being collected. Like if I'm surveying people about, I don't know, whatever, their satisfaction with a flight. I don't really care if I overrepresent people with brown hair because that has nothing to do with their satisfaction with a flight, right? So I want to think about who's being underrepresented potentially in relation to their satisfaction, right? So I want to make sure I don't overrepresent first-class passengers or underrepresent coach passengers, right? I want proportional representation of each. So we always want to connect that who's underrepresented in relation to what data we're collecting, what we're measuring our response variable. We then want to take that a step further and specifically state like which response is going to be over or underrepresented, right? So maybe I do a convenient sample. I just ask the front of the plane. So I way overrepresent first class. As a result, I think I'm going to see people saying, yes, this was a satisfactory flight. Might be overrepresented, right? Because they were comfy up in those first class seats. I mean, I don't know. I can't fly first class. And then the third thing that we want to do a lot of times is connect specifically to a statistic, or it could be a parameter that we're trying to estimate, right? Might be underrepresented. So if I do a convenience sample, ask the front of the plane, excuse me, I get mostly first class passengers, so they're overrepresented. As a result, yes, I'm satisfied with the flight is overrepresented. And then bullet 3 here is saying, or number 3 saying, so I'm going to probably overrepresent the percent of passengers who are satisfied with their flight, or underrepresent maybe the percent of passengers who are dissatisfied. So those are some general tips for how to write about bias. And the best thing really that you can do is look at a bunch of free response and, practice. A lot of times these are, part B or part C embedded within another topic on the exam. I don't, sometimes there's its own bias question, but a lot of times, especially in the most recent years, it's kind of blended in. So, right, just start doing practice. That's the best way to practice your writing. Always write specific to the context. And the last tip is you do not have to name the type of bias unless a question asks you to do so. And this is important. You could really answer most of the free response that have been on the AP exam without knowing any of the names of the type of bias. So there's really no upside to naming the bias. Now, if you're 100% confident, you're like, I know this is under coverage, sure, add that name. But the reason I say there's not much upside is if you name the bias and you give the incorrect name, that's going to be held against you, right? So if you describe perfectly these numbers 1, 2, and 3 above, but then you finish with, this is voluntary response bias, and that's the wrong name, you've kind of ruined your perfect answer by adding something that's false. But you could get essentially correct on the exam without that name. So there's not much benefit for adding the name on a free response. The only time you have to do that is if a question says name the bias, which at least from what I've seen is much less common. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. That's it for the generic notes. You can kind of pause or whatever, end this thing now if you're done, or maybe a better idea, just quick, here are some examples. So here's a context at the top. Oh, sorry, that's a free response we're going to do. You can pause and read that if you want. Try that out. I think this is 2004, an oldie but goodie. So if you look up, if you just start typing this question in Google, the answers will come up. So if you want to practice writing, pause it, try it out, start typing this in, scoring rubric will come up. But for here, so here's a context we have, just to kind of see some of these types of bias, these specific types in action. So we've got a community organization. They're going to survey members about a town's local park. They put 1,000 surveys on car windshields in the parking lot. Think about what method that is. 520 people returned a completed survey. Of these 520, 415 said the park needed repair. They give us the survey question here. And so this asks us, to name each type of bias. So what you should do is read this and try to tell or try to decide. I mean, you could tell me, but like, I can't hear you. What kind of bias is this? And hopefully you decided. Pause it if you didn't yet. Try non-response bias. The reason you see some underlining here is I've tried to write this in a way like where you could just change the blanks. Now, again, you're not going to probably not on a free response going to have to define a specific type of bias, but if it helps you, I've tried to provide like a writing template here. So it might not work perfectly for every context, but really you can just change what's in the underlying parts. And like the rest of this could be pretty universal. So if you like memorizing sentence and fill in the blanks, which is not the best way to learn, right? That's not learning stuff, memorizing. But at the same time, it might help you with your writing. How about this one? So I intentionally left this open to both types of bias. And since we're talking about the wording of the question, hopefully we immediately know we're talking about response bias. Now, if you are writing about response bias, that leading question, notice here how I didn't just say the question leads people to say, yes, the part does need repair, right? We're literally quoting the question, right? Showing which wording leads to this overrepresented response. In this particular question, you kind of could have argued either way that it pushes people to yes or no. That was just by design for the sake of practice. And so here you can see another example. And again, right, you can just think about filling in the underlined parts, leaving the rest the same. Number 3. Why would I put that there? Oh, you know why? Because that's not really where I want to go for number 3. I really want to do this. Oh, no, I don't. I have no idea what I'm talking about. Here's number 3. It's a voluntary response sample. You know what the answer is. Voluntary response bias. Don't just write voluntary response. Be thorough. And again, there's a template. Like pretty much you could try to steal this sentence and write this same exact sentence every single time for voluntary response bias and just fill in that one blank. And then lastly, I mean, there's only one we haven't talked about. And it is, oh, there it is. I got really nervous that I somehow didn't save it. A lot of underlined here, so maybe that's not that helpful. This is our example of under coverage. This is kind of wordy. This actually should all be underlined right here, right? Because this is specific to this context. So it turns out this is a pretty useless template because I underlined the entire thing, but the other 3 were all right. And so there you have some examples of types of bias. Naming bias, probably going to be some multiple choice, and we'll look at some writing about bias-free response in class. And that's it. Have a wonderful day. And this video is definitely longer than I wanted it to be.